Jerusalem was burning. The smoke did not rise in a single column but in thick, restless waves that blurred the skyline where the temple once stood in solemn beauty. The cries of soldiers mingled with the crackling of timber beams and the collapse of stone. Sacred vessels were seized, gates were broken. The city of David, which had stood through generations of warning and prophecy, now trembled beneath foreign boots. Babylon had come, and it had not come to negotiate. Among the captives driven from the city were young men of noble blood, chosen not for their weakness but for their promise. They were strong, intelligent, unblemished, capable of standing in a royal court. They were not chained like common prisoners. They were selected. Daniel was among them. He had likely walked the courts of Jerusalem in earlier days, perhaps glimpsed the rituals of priests, heard the reading of the law, felt the rhythm of feast days and sacrifices. He had grown up beneath the shadow of covenant history. The stories of Moses, of David, of Solomon would not have been distant legends but identity. The temple was not merely architecture, it was assurance that God dwelt among his people. Now he walked away from it in silence. The journey to Babylon was long, stretching across desert and uncertainty. The young captives would have watched Jerusalem shrink into memory. Dust rose beneath their feet by day, and the desert wind cut cold by night. Soldiers escorted them, disciplined and unyielding. No one explained the future. Babylon, when it finally appeared, was overwhelming. Its walls towered. Its gates were adorned with images of beasts and symbols of dominion. The city pulsed with wealth and confidence. Gardens rose on terraces. The Euphrates cut through its center like a polished blade. Temples to foreign gods stood proudly, their idols unashamed of display. Everything in Babylon declared permanence. For a young exile, the message was clear. Your God has been defeated. Yet defeat, in God's purposes, is not always what it seems. King Nebuchadnezzar did not merely conquer cities, he absorbed their brilliance. The wisest of the conquered were trained for service in his court. He believed strength could be multiplied by intelligence. So the young Judean nobles were placed under the care of Ashpenaz, chief of the eunuchs. They were to be taught the language and literature of the Chaldeans. For 3 years they would study. They would eat from the king's provision. They would be reshaped. Names were given new names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, a name invoking Babylonian deities. Identity was being rewritten deliberately. Language would change, education would change, diet would change. Everything that marked them as sons of Judah was subject to transformation. Empires understand something. If you reshape memory, you reshape allegiance. The king's food was not mere nourishment, it was participation. To eat from his table signified loyalty. The meat likely violated dietary commands given through Moses. It may have been sacrificed to idols. To consume it without question was to begin adapting silently. No one demanded that Daniel deny his God. They simply invited him to adjust. It is often easier to resist open persecution than subtle assimilation. In the quiet of his new quarters, surrounded by foreign sounds and unfamiliar scent of incense to other gods, Daniel faced his first test. There was no audience, no lions, no decree carved in stone, just a decision about food. He resolved in his heart not to defile himself. The text does not describe anger or protest, it describes resolve. Something within him remained unmovable despite everything outside shifting. Jerusalem might lie in ruins, but the law written upon his heart did not burn with the temple. He approached Ashpenaz with respect, not rebellion. He requested permission to abstain from the king's food. The official feared for his own life. If the young men appeared weaker than others, the king would hold him responsible. Babylon operated on accountability sharpened by threat. Daniel proposed to test 10 days of vegetables and water. Let their appearance be compared afterward. It was a small window of time in the vast machinery of empire, 10 days, yet within that limited frame, faith would be measured. Those days likely passed without spectacle. No lightning from heaven, no visible miracle in the sky above Babylon's towers, just quiet obedience at a table set differently from others. Perhaps they endured mockery, perhaps curiosity, perhaps indifference, but they held steady. At the end of 10 days, they appeared healthier, stronger than those who had eaten the royal delicacies. The steward allowed the arrangement to continue. It was a quiet victory. No crowds gathered to applaud discipline. No proclamation echoed through the streets. Yet something profound had happened. In the heart of the most powerful empire of that age, for young exiles had proven that obedience to God was not dependent on geography. Jerusalem was gone. The covenant was not. God honored their faithfulness not only in physical health but in intellectual capacity. They were granted knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Daniel in particular received understanding in visions and dreams. This was not accidental. Babylon prized interpretation of dreams. It relied on magicians, enchanters, astrologers, men trained in mystical arts. Daniel would not compete through superstition. He would stand through revelation. 3 years passed. The young captives matured in knowledge of Babylonian literature while remaining anchored in the law of their fathers. They learned the language of empire without surrendering the language of faith. They stood before Nebuchadnezzar at the appointed time. The king examined them. Questions were asked. Dialogues unfolded. Observations were made. and in every matter of wisdom and understanding he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his realm. 10 times. The empire that sought to absorb them discovered that their strength came from a source it did not control. Daniel stood in Babylon not as a broken exile, but as a witness. He did not preach in the streets. He did not revolt against the throne. He simply remained faithful. There is a quiet power in that kind of faith. He had lost homeland, temple, language of worship sung in familiar courts. He now bore a foreign name. He lived beneath authority that did not honor his God, yet nothing external could compel internal surrender. Faith in exile is refined differently than faith in comfort. In Jerusalem, obedience might have been reinforced by community rhythm, by public worship, by visible reminders of covenant. In Babylon, obedience was private, personal, voluntary, and that is where its purity was proven. Daniel's story does not begin in a lion's den. It begins at a table. It begins with a young man who understood that compromise rarely arrives announcing catastrophe. It arrives disguised as opportunity, advancement, convenience. Had he accepted the king's provision without question, no immediate disaster would have struck. He would still have advanced, still have learned, still have stood in court, but something subtle would have shifted. Allegiance would have thinned. Instead, in the small matter, he guarded the greater. Years later, when decrees would threaten his life, when lions would prowl in darkness around him, the courage displayed there would not be sudden heroism. It would be the natural extension of habits formed early. Faithfulness in obscurity prepares strength in crisis. The fall of Jerusalem had appeared to declare the superiority of Babylon's gods, but Daniel's quiet obedience declared another reality. Kingdoms rise and fall under the sovereign permission of the Most High. He did not yet see how that truth would unfold. He did not yet know he would interpret dreams that foretold empires crumbling like clay. He did not yet know he would stand before multiple kings across decades of political upheaval. He was simply a young exile who refused to defile himself. And God met him there. The towers of Babylon gleamed under the sun. Its markets bustled. Its priests burned incense to idols carved from stone. Its armies marched with confidence of permanence, yet within its walls walked a servant of the living God, whose loyalty did not depend on national strength. Jerusalem had fallen, but faith had not. Daniel's life in Babylon began not with spectacle, but with resolve and inward decision that exile would not redefine worship, and from that decision would unfold a story that no empire could silence, a testimony that would echo long after Babylon's own walls lay in dust. The lions were still far in the future, but the faith that would face them was already alive. Babylon did not sleep. Even at night, the city hummed beneath the weight of its own ambition. Torches burned along palace corridors. Incense curled upward from temple altars dedicated to gods carved in gold and stone. Guards rotated their posts with disciplined precision. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, merchants whispered of profit and caravans prepared for distant trade routes. The empire believed itself eternal. Within the royal chambers, however, eternity felt fragile. King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed it was not an ordinary dream, the kind that dissolves with morning light. This one clung to him. It pressed upon his chest like unseen weight. Images flickered in his mind with unsettling clarity. Yet when he reached for them upon waking, they fractured and fled. Only dread remained. For a ruler who commanded armies and shaped nations, there is something deeply unsettling about losing control within the privacy of one's own mind. He summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, men trained from youth to interpret mysteries. They had long claimed access to hidden realms. They stood now beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with Babylonian symbols, confident in their robes and ritual knowledge. The king demanded not merely interpretation. He demanded the dream itself. "Tell me what I dreamed," he insisted, "and then explain it." A silence fell heavier than armor. The wise men protested carefully. No king, they said, had ever demanded such a thing. Interpretation, yes, but the revealing of the dream itself belonged to the gods, and the gods did not dwell with flesh. They spoke more truth than they realized. Nebuchadnezzar's patience snapped. If they could not access what they claimed to know, then their wisdom was fraud. He ordered their execution. The decree spread swiftly. All the wise men of Babylon were to be destroyed. Daniel had not been present in the first exchange, yet the sentence included him. Arioch, captain of the king's guard, began carrying out the command. It was not personal, it was administrative. The machinery of empire moves efficiently when fueled by fear. When Daniel learned of the decree, panic is not recorded in his response. He did not flee, he did not organize protest, he sought audience. With measured courage, he approached Arioch and inquired about the urgency. Learning the cause, Daniel requested time from the king, promising that the dream and its interpretation would be revealed. This was not reckless bravado. It was faith anchored in relationship. He returned to his companions Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and together they sought mercy from the God of heaven. The contrast is striking. While Babylon's wise men claimed that no God dwelt with flesh, Daniel turned to the living God who hears whispered petitions in exile. Night fell again over the city. In some chamber of the palace, the king likely wrestled with unease, haunted by half-remembered fragments. In another part of the city, condemned men perhaps prepared for death. And in the quiet quarters of 4 Judean exiles, prayers rose not to idols plated in gold, but to the unseen Lord of history. It was in a vision during the night that the mystery was revealed to Daniel. The dream unfolded with clarity not borrowed from human intellect but granted from heaven. Gratitude came before action. Daniel did not rush immediately to announce his discovery. He blessed the name of God. "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever," he declared, "for wisdom and might are his. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." The empire believed Nebuchadnezzar held absolute authority. Daniel knew otherwise. Morning brought him before Arioch, who hurried to present him to the king. The tension in the throne room must have been palpable. Failure meant death. Success would challenge the foundations of Babylon's spiritual claims. Nebuchadnezzar fixed his gaze upon the young exile. "Are you able to make known to me the dream and its interpretation?" Daniel's reply did not begin with self-promotion. "The secret which the king has demanded," he said, "the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets." It was a quiet dismantling of Babylon's pride. Daniel then recounted the dream in detail. The king had seen a great image. Its head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Then a stone cut without hands struck the image at its feet. The statue shattered. The metals became like chaff blown by wind. The stone grew into a great mountain filling the whole earth. As Daniel spoke, recognition would have flickered across Nebuchadnezzar's face. This was indeed the dream, but interpretation carried greater weight. "You, O king," Daniel continued, "are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, then a fourth strong as iron. But in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." The room must have held its breath. Babylon prided itself on permanence. Its architecture, its military, its culture all testified to dominion. Yet here stood a young exile declaring that empires are temporary, that succession is inevitable, that a kingdom not made by human hands would ultimately prevail. Nebuchadnezzar did not erupt in rage. He fell. The king of Babylon fell on his face before Daniel. He acknowledged that Daniel's God is truly God of gods and Lord of kings, a revealer of secrets. Promotion followed revelation. Daniel was elevated over the province of Babylon and made chief administrator over all the wise men. His companions were appointed over affairs of the province. An exile now governed within the empire that conquered his homeland. But power did not originate from ambition. It originated from faithfulness. The pattern that began at a dining table continued in a throne room. Daniel did not compromise when compromise seemed small. He did not panic when danger intensified. He did not claim glory when revelation arrived. He pointed upward. The dream itself revealed something deeper than political forecast. It exposed the fragile architecture of human dominance. Gold yields to silver, silver to bronze, bronze to iron, iron fractures into brittle mixture. No empire, however magnificent, endures unchallenged. Strength decays, glory tarnishes, authority shifts. But the stone cut without hands, that kingdom arises differently, not by military conquest, not by forced allegiance. It originates beyond human crafting. It grows steadily until it fills the earth. Daniel stood as witness to that coming reality. In the heart of Babylon, beneath ceilings engraved with symbols of false gods, the truth rang clear. History moves under divine sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar's troubled dream had been more than personal anxiety. It was revelation that his reign, though dazzling, was limited. His golden head would not remain forever. For Daniel, this knowledge fortified rather than frightened. He served within Babylon faithfully, yet his hope did not root itself in Babylon's longevity. He understood something that emperors often ignore. Authority is granted, not inherent. The wise men who claimed the gods did not dwell with flesh were proven wrong. The God of heaven had revealed secrets to a servant in exile. He had intervened not to glorify Daniel alone, but to demonstrate that divine rule transcends political boundaries. The tension in the palace eased temporarily. Executions ceased. Celebration likely replaced dread among those spared. Yet, beneath the surface a greater narrative unfolded. Empires rise and fall. Kings dream and fear. Decrees threaten and dissolve. But the God who reveals mysteries remains unchanged. Daniel's faith was no longer quiet obedience at a table. It had become public testimony before a throne. Yet its essence was the same, unwavering allegiance in foreign land. He had not sought prominence. He had sought mercy. He had not demanded recognition. He had given glory, and in doing so, he stood as living contradiction to Babylon's claim of supremacy. The statue of metals would one day crumble, but the kingdom announced in that dream would stand. Daniel believed it, and that belief would carry him through decades still to come. The years did not soften Babylon's pride, if anything. The revelation of the dream seemed to harden something in Nebuchadnezzar rather than humble it permanently. For a moment he had bowed, acknowledging the God of Daniel as Lord of Kings. For a moment he had glimpsed the fragile nature of his golden authority. But time has a way of dulling conviction when power remains intact. Gold still filled his treasuries. Armies still obeyed his command. The city still stood unchallenged. And so the king built an image. It rose on the plain of Dura, towering against the sky, a monument plated entirely in gold. Not a statue composed of diminishing metals, not a reminder of succession and fragility, but a single gleaming declaration. Babylon endures. Perhaps the dream lingered in his memory like an unwelcome whisper. Perhaps the image was his answer to it. If the vision had shown a head of gold giving way to lesser materials, then he would craft a symbol that contradicted the prophecy. All gold, no decline, no fracture, no stone cut without hands. The dedication became spectacle. Satraps, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, every layer of authority gathered. Music swelled through the plain, instruments resonating under open sky. The decree rang clear. At the sound of horn, flute, harp, and lyre, all peoples, nations, and languages must fall down and worship the golden image. Whoever refused would be cast immediately into a burning fiery furnace. There was no ambiguity. Worship was mandatory. This was not philosophical debate. It was enforced conformity. Among the officials standing in ordered rows were the companions of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known in Babylon as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel himself is not named in this moment, perhaps occupied elsewhere in administration, but the test unfolding struck at the heart of the faith they shared. Music filled the air. Bodies fell like synchronized grain before wind. Yet three figures remained upright. It was not defiance born of arrogance. It was conviction anchored deeper than fear. They had walked this path before in smaller matters. They had resolved long ago that allegiance to God could not be negotiated. The king's table had not claimed them. The king's language had not redefined them. And now the king's image would not command their worship. In a sea of bowed heads, standing becomes thunderous. Their refusal did not go unnoticed. Certain Chaldeans, quick to accuse, approached the king with calculated precision. They reminded him of the decree. They named the offenders. These men, O king, whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Rage flared. Nebuchadnezzar summoned them. His fury was not merely religious, it was political. Public disobedience undermines authority, yet he offered them a second chance. When you hear the sound of the instruments, fall down and worship, but if you do not, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? The question hung in the air, sharpened by challenge. Who is the God? Their reply did not tremble. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image. But if not, those three words carried weight heavier than iron. Their faith did not depend upon guaranteed rescue. It rested in God's sovereignty, not in predictable outcomes. Whether deliverance came through miracle or through death, allegiance would not shift. Nebuchadnezzar's face changed. The furnace was heated 7 times hotter than usual, as though intensity could erase conviction. Mighty men of valor bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their garments and cast them into the flames. The heat was so fierce it killed the soldiers who threw them in. Fire consumes indiscriminately. The 3 fell bound into the furnace. Then the unexpected occurred. The king rose in astonishment. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? He demanded. Look, he said, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like a son of the gods. The furnace that was meant to display imperial terror became stage for divine presence. They were not writhing, they were walking. The flames that devoured soldiers outside did not scorch their garments. The ropes that bound them were gone. Freedom existed inside the fire. Nebuchadnezzar approached the mouth of the furnace, calling them out as servants of the Most High God. They emerged without smell of smoke clinging to them, hair unsinged, clothing intact. The crowd that had bowed in fear now witnessed something greater than spectacle. The king spoke again, his tone altered by awe. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. A new decree followed. No one was to speak against their God. Babylon's furnace had failed, yet the deeper confrontation remained unresolved. Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged God before. He would do so again. But acknowledgement does not equal surrender. Pride, once rooted deeply, resists removal. Time passed. The empire flourished further. Nebuchadnezzar walked upon the roof of his palace, gazing over the city he had expanded. Its walls stretched wide. Its gardens climbed in terraces. Its temples shimmered. From that vantage point, sovereignty must have felt tangible beneath his feet. Is not this great Babylon that I have built by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? The words had barely left his mouth when a voice fell from heaven. The kingdom had departed from him. He would be driven from men. He would dwell with beasts of the field. His mind would fracture until he learned that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. The transition was immediate. The king who commanded armies lost command of himself. He was driven from human society, eating grass like oxen, his body wet with dew, hair grown long, nails like birds' claws. The golden head of the statue became a humbled creature beneath the open sky. Power had not insulated him from correction. Seasons changed. Time accomplished what pride resisted. At the end of the appointed period, Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes to heaven. Understanding returned. He blessed the Most High and praised him whose dominion is everlasting. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. He declared, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down. 'Twas a confession born not from dream alone, nor from furnace spectacle, but from personal humbling. Daniel had witnessed it all. He had stood before a throne demanding revelation. He had seen friends walk through fire unconsumed. He had watched the mightiest ruler of his age reduced to madness and restored to clarity. Through each event, one truth crystallized: empires may roar, but heaven governs. Daniel's faith matured, not in isolation but through unfolding demonstrations of divine authority. He did not manipulate outcomes. He did not incite rebellion. He served faithfully within structures that often opposed his beliefs, trusting that sovereignty belongs ultimately to God. The furnace flames flickered out long ago. Nebuchadnezzar's pride had risen and fallen. Babylon continued, but its invincibility had been punctured by revelation. The kingdom of gold was magnificent, but it was not eternal. And Daniel knew that the story of empires was still being written under a hand unseen by kings. Nebuchadnezzar's reign ended not in the blaze of conquest but in the quiet recognition that dominion belongs to heaven. For a time, Babylon seemed steadied by that confession. The king who had once demanded worship now spoke of the Most High with reverence born from humiliation. Yet empires are not transformed permanently by a single man's awakening. When a ruler dies, memory fades faster than marble cracks. The throne did not remain empty. Successors rose, some stronger in ambition than in wisdom, and the atmosphere within Babylon shifted once more. The city still glittered beneath the sun. Its walls still inspired awe. Its markets still throbbed with wealth drawn from conquered lands. But spiritual amnesia is subtle. What one generation learns through discipline, the next may treat as distant legend. Daniel remained. Years had passed since he first walked into Babylon as a captive youth. Lines of age now marked his face. His responsibilities had expanded under successive administrations. He had interpreted dreams, witnessed furnaces blaze, and seen a king reduced to madness. Through transitions of power, he endured not by political maneuvering but by consistency. Under a new ruler, Belshazzar, Babylon's confidence returned to arrogance. Strength breeds carelessness when consequences feel delayed. The vessels once carried from Jerusalem's temple had long been stored among royal treasures, sacred objects from a conquered nation. They were trophies of superiority. On a night of feasting, Belshazzar commanded that those vessels be brought forth. The hall filled with nobles, wives, and concubines. Wine flowed freely. Laughter echoed off carved pillars. Music and excess mingled in reckless celebration. And with deliberate irreverence, the king drank from the cups dedicated to the God of Israel. Praise was offered not to heaven, but to gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. It was not ignorance, it was mockery. In that moment, as revelry reached its height, fingers appeared. They were not attached to visible body. They emerged against plastered wall, riding opposite the lampstand where all could see. The hand moved deliberately, etching words that froze laughter mid-breath. The color drained from the king's face. His knees struck together. Strength fled his limbs. Music faltered into silence. Terror replaced intoxication. Once again, Babylon summoned its wise men. Once again, they failed. The writing remained indecipherable to those trained in ritual and omen. Promises of reward filled the air. Purple garments, chains of gold. Third place in the kingdom, but no answer came. Panic thickened. Then the queen mother, remembering older days, spoke of Daniel. She recounted how in the time of Nebuchadnezzar there had been a man in whom was the spirit of the holy God. A man found to have light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Daniel, she urged, would give interpretation. He was brought before Belshazzar. The contrast was stark. An aged exile stood before a trembling king who had dishonored sacred vessels. Belshazzar offered rewards, attempting to entice compliance. Daniel declined the gifts. "Let your gifts be for yourself," he said, "yet I will read the writing to the king." Before interpreting, he spoke history. He reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar, of his greatness, his pride, his humbling, and his restoration when he acknowledged the Most High. "And you, his son," Daniel declared, "have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this." Knowledge ignored intensifies accountability. The words on the wall were few but final. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, numbered, weighed, divided. God had numbered the days of his kingdom and finished it. He had been weighed in the balances and found wanting. His kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Judgment, written without negotiation. Belshazzar honored his promise outwardly, clothing Daniel in purple and placing a chain upon him. But garments cannot shield from decree written by heaven. That very night, Babylon fell. The city thought impenetrable succumbed swiftly. While wine still lingered in banquet cups, foreign forces entered. Belshazzar was slain. Darius the Mede received the kingdom. The Golden Empire had fractured exactly as the dream foretold. Daniel had watched prophecy unfold across decades. What began as vision in a troubled king's sleep now manifested in historical shift. The head of gold yielded to another. Yet Daniel did not celebrate the fall. He understood transitions are not chaos but governance under divine timing. Babylon's glory had been real, its architecture impressive, its military formidable, but its longevity was never ultimate. Now under Darius, administrative restructuring occurred, satraps were appointed, layers of leadership arranged for efficiency. Daniel distinguished himself quickly, because an excellent spirit was in him. The king planned to set him over the whole realm. Excellence invites envy. Officials who had bowed before golden statues and feasted in reckless halls now searched for fault in the aged statesman. They examined his administration, scrutinized his decisions, combed through records. They found nothing corrupt. Integrity frustrates those seeking leverage. Unable to accuse him in matters of governance, they turned to the one realm they believed predictable: his devotion to God. They reasoned that unless a law could be crafted to conflict directly with his worship, no accusation would stand. So they approached Darius with flattery. Establish a royal statute. They urged that for 30 days no petition shall be made to any god or man except you, O king, under penalty of being cast into the den of lions. The appeal was subtle: consolidate loyalty, unify devotion under imperial authority. Darius, perhaps unaware of deeper motives, signed the decree. It became binding under the law of the Medes and Persians, which could not be altered. When Daniel learned that the document was signed, he did not convene council. He did not stage protest. He went to his house where windows opened toward Jerusalem, and he knelt as he had done previously 3 times a day, giving thanks before his God. Routine faithfulness became public defiance only because decree demanded silence. The trap closed swiftly. Officials caught him praying and brought accusation before the king. Darius was distressed. He labored until sunset to deliver Daniel, but law bound his authority. The same rigidity that empowered imperial control now restricted personal mercy. Daniel was brought to the den. The king spoke with reluctant hope. Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. A stone sealed the entrance. Royal signet secured it. Darkness swallowed the aged prophet. Outside, Darius passed sleepless night, fasting, refusing entertainment. At dawn he hurried to the den and cried with anxious voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to deliver you from the lions? From within came reply, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me. In the den meant for execution, divine protection prevailed. Accusers were later cast into that same pit, and the lions overpowered them instantly. Another decree spread throughout the realm that men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed. Again and again, rulers confessed truth under pressure of revelation. But Daniel's faith had never depended on their proclamations. From golden statue to fiery furnace, from palace rooftop to banquet hall, from madness in field to writing on wall, from transition of empire to lion's den, one theme threaded every scene. Kingdoms rise with spectacle and fall with suddenness, but the sovereignty of God remains untouched. Daniel had entered Babylon as captive youth. He now stood as elder statesman under Second Empire. Gold had yielded to silver, yet the stone cut without hands had not yet fully filled the earth. And Daniel knew history was still moving, measured not by pride of kings, but by decree of heaven. The first return to Jerusalem did not erase exile from Daniel's heart. When Cyrus issued the decree allowing the Jewish people to return and rebuild the house of their God, caravans gathered with cautious hope. Families prepared to leave the city that had once enslaved them. Songs long silenced began to rise again in expectation. Of Zion, the 70 years spoken through Jeremiah were drawing to fulfillment. But Daniel did not lead the caravan. Age anchored him in Babylon. He had spent nearly an entire lifetime beneath foreign skies. His body, once strong enough to endure royal courts and sleepless nights of prayer, now bore the weight of decades. He had served under Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. He had seen walls fall and empires fracture. Now he witnessed restoration begin yet from a distance. It is possible to see promise fulfilled and still feel the ache of unfinished longing. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, Daniel entered a period of mourning. For 3 full weeks he ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine touched his lips. He did not anoint himself. The text does not describe public crisis. It describes private burden. Something weighed upon him. Perhaps reports from Jerusalem spoke of resistance, of discouragement among those rebuilding. Perhaps the weight of earlier visions pressed heavily upon his mind, the beasts, the little horn, the desecrations yet to come. Restoration had begun, but the path ahead would not be simple triumph. He fasted, he prayed, and he waited. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as he stood by the great river Tigris, heaven opened once more. He lifted his eyes and saw a man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. The men with Daniel did not see the vision, but great terror fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. Daniel alone remained. Strength drained from him, his vigor turned to frailty. He fell into deep sleep with his face to the ground. Then a hand touched him. It set him trembling upon his knees and palms. A voice spoke gently. "O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you. Man greatly beloved." After decades of service in hostile courts, after nights in lions' dens and seasons of mourning, heaven addressed him not as exile, not as captive, not as administrator, but as beloved. He was told that from the first day he set his heart to understand and humble himself before God, his words were heard. Yet the messenger had been delayed 21 days, withstanding the prince of the kingdom of Persia until Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help. Daniel glimpsed what had always been unseen. Behind the movements of empires, behind decrees and wars and policies, spiritual conflict raged. Kings believed themselves architects of history, but invisible forces contended over influence and direction. What appeared political on earth was often spiritual in origin. The delay in answer had not been indifference, it had been warfare. The messenger strengthened Daniel and spoke of what would befall his people in the latter days. The revelation unfolded not as poetic symbol alone, but with startling specificity. Kings of the north and south would rise and clash. Alliances would form through marriage and fracture through betrayal. Armies would invade and retreat. Treasuries would be plundered. Sanctuary would again be defiled. The Holy Covenant would face contempt. Daniel listened as future centuries were narrated in advance. The Persian Empire would give way to Greece. A mighty king would arise, but his kingdom would be broken and divided toward the four winds. Successors would struggle for dominance north against south generation after generation. The land of Israel would lie between powers, trampled by ambition not its own. It was not romantic prophecy. It was detailed turbulence. At the center of this unfolding stood a contemptible person who would seize the kingdom by intrigue. He would exalt himself above every god, speak blasphemies, persecute the holy people, and prosper for a time. He would desecrate what was sacred and magnify himself in arrogance. Daniel had already seen such patterns in smaller scale. Now he understood their repetition across history, yet the revelation did not end in tyranny. The arrogant ruler would come to his end, and none would help him. The appointed time would reach completion. Deliverance would come for those whose names were written in the book. Still, the weight of what he heard crushed him. He turned his face toward the ground and became speechless. Breath seemed distant. Again he was touched and strengthened. Again he was reminded not to fear. Fear had not ruled Daniel before lions, but this was different. A man can confront immediate death with clarity. It is harder to absorb generations of suffering foretold. He learned that Michael, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of his people, would arise. There would be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. Yet at that time deliverance would come for many, and those who sleep in the dust of the earth would awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise would shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever. The vision leapt beyond empires, beyond Persia, beyond Greece, beyond Rome, yet to rise, it pierced into resurrection. For the first time so clearly, Daniel heard of a day when death itself would not hold dominion. The kingdom promised to the Son of Man would not merely replace earthly governments, it would transform existence. Not everything was for his generation to understand, not everything was for him to resolve. He asked how long these wonders would last. The answer spoke of time, times, and half a time, of scattering, of purification, of refining. Many would be purified and made white, but the wicked would continue in wickedness. The words were measured. History would not spiral uncontrolled. It would proceed within divine boundaries. At last, Daniel was told to go his way until the end, for he would rest, and then arise to his inheritance at the end of the days. Rest. The word must have settled gently upon an aging heart. He who had interpreted dreams for kings would not see every fulfillment with earthly eyes. He would rest, yet he would arise again in the inheritance promised. The man who had been carried into Babylon as captive youth was now nearing the close of his journey. He had seen the head of gold humbled, the fiery furnace defied, the lion's den conquered, the handwriting on the wall fulfilled. He had witnessed empires turn like pages. Now he saw beyond them all. The beasts would rage, the arrogant would boast, the holy would suffer, but the Ancient of Days remained seated, the Son of Man would reign, and resurrection awaited. Daniel rose from the riverbank, changed not by promotion, not by miracle of survival, but by glimpse into ultimate victory. The world around him still bore scars of conquest. Jerusalem still struggled to rebuild. Political tension still brewed beneath imperial order, yet his vision extended beyond immediate struggle. He walked back into his remaining days, not with illusions of easy peace, but with certainty that history bends toward a kingdom no beast can devour and no tyrant can corrupt. The beloved servant would one day rest, and when he awakened it would not be under Babylon's shadow but beneath the everlasting dominion of the king he had served all his life. The years grew thin. Empires that once roared like storm winds now felt like distant echoes in Daniel's memory. The Babylon that had towered in splendor when he first arrived as a captive was gone. Persia ruled with disciplined order. Jerusalem, though scarred and fragile, stirred with rebuilding. Caravans had returned. Foundations were being laid. Priests once more approached an altar in a land that had tasted desolation. And Daniel remained where his story had begun in exile. Age had narrowed his physical world. He no longer stood daily in courts of shifting power. His name was still respected, but the weight of administration had passed to younger hands. The battles he now faced were not before kings, but within reflection. He had lived long enough to see prophecy fulfilled. He had lived long enough to see promise begun, but he would not live long enough to see it completed. That realization settles differently upon a faithful heart. Youth believes it will witness culmination. Age learns that faith often plants seeds it will never watch bloom. Daniel's life was not defined by a single triumph. It was shaped by endurance across decades. He had purposed in his heart as a teenager not to defile himself. He had spoken courageously before Nebuchadnezzar when execution loomed. He had watched friends walk unharmed through fire. He had interpreted judgment written in plaster. He had slept among lions and awakened to dawn. He had seen visions that stretched beyond his century into distant ages, and still, the world remained fractured. Even with Cyrus's decree, rebuilding Jerusalem proved difficult. Opposition arose quickly. Neighboring peoples resented restoration. Bureaucratic obstacles slowed construction. The temple's foundation was laid amid some weeping with joy, others with sorrow that the new structure could not compare with Solomon's former glory. Daniel knew that tension intimately. He had served under kings whose words acknowledged the Most High, yet their empires still oppressed. He had seen miracles that did not prevent future trials. He had received revelations of everlasting dominion, yet daily life continued within imperfect systems. Faith, he had learned, is not the absence of unresolved tension. It is endurance within it. He likely walked quieter streets now, leaning on staff where once he strode with confidence. Those who recognized him may have whispered stories to their children. This is the one who survived lions. This is the one who read the king's dream. This is the one whose God shut mouths of fire and beasts alike. But Daniel himself would have known the deeper truth. He had survived not because of extraordinary resilience, but because he belonged to a kingdom that outlasts death. In the quiet of his later years, memory must have revisited him often. The first night in Babylon, the aroma of food from the king's table, the tension of choosing obedience over assimilation, the trembling of Nebuchadnezzar before a dream interpreted, the roar of furnace flames, the eerie silence when lions did not attack, the overwhelming brilliance of the Ancient of Days seated upon fiery throne. His life formed a tapestry woven from obedience and revelation, yet he never became central hero of his own narrative. He consistently directed attention upward toward God who reveals mysteries, who humbles kings, who establishes times and seasons. That humility marked him even at the end. When he asked for understanding regarding final visions, he was told to go his way. The words were sealed. The timeline extended beyond his comprehension. It would not be his task to decode every detail. There is surrender in that command. Go your way, not in defeat but in trust. The prophetic weight he carried did not demand he solve history. It required he remain faithful within his appointed span. He had done so from youth to old age. His contemporaries might measure significance by monuments erected or territories conquered. Daniel left no palace with his name carved above the door. He commanded no army. He authored no empire. Yet his influence threaded through kingdoms. He shaped policy without compromise. He demonstrated that integrity can survive political turbulence. He revealed that prayer can outlast decree. He proved that faithfulness in private shapes courage in public, and more than that, he became witness to a pattern that generations would revisit. The righteous may be exiled, but they are not abandoned. The arrogant may ascend, but they are not secure. The suffering may endure for a season, but sovereignty remains in heaven. As his strength faded, perhaps he considered the promise spoken beside the river, "You shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days." Rest, for a man who had carried visions of beasts and blazing thrones. Rest must have sounded like mercy. He had seen enough of earthly turbulence. He had walked through enough confrontation between pride and humility, between decree and devotion. Rest did not mean obscurity. It meant completion. The young exile who refused the king's food would one day stand again, not in Babylon, not in Persia, but in the inheritance promised by the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man he saw in vision would reign in fullness. The resurrection foretold would not leave him in dust. History would move on after his burial. Persia would yield to Greece. Greece would fracture. Rome would rise. Nations would clash. Faithful men and women would read his writings in times of persecution and draw courage from them. In dark eras when tyrants exalted themselves and desecrated what was holy, Daniel's visions would remind believers that beasts have expiration dates. And somewhere beneath the soil of exile, Daniel would sleep. The lion's den had not claimed him. Fire had not consumed him. But time would gently close his eyes. He would not witness the full restoration of Jerusalem. He would not see the ultimate fulfillment of the Son of Man's dominion. Yet his story did not end in Babylonian dust, for he belonged not to the empire that captured him, nor to the empire that later honored him. He belonged to a kingdom whose throne burns with righteousness and whose reign has no end. The aged prophet, beloved of heaven, had walked faithfully through shifting powers. He had interpreted dreams of metal and beasts, and in doing so revealed the fragile nature of all human dominion. Now, as his earthly journey neared its conclusion, one truth stood clearer than ever. Kings rise, kingdoms fall, but the kingdom of God does not tremble. And Daniel, servant of the living God, would soon rest awaiting the dawn when he would stand again, not as exile in foreign court, but as citizen of everlasting dominion. Time moved forward. Empires that once dominated Daniel's world became chapters in history. Persia, mighty and disciplined, eventually yielded to a Greek conqueror whose speed stunned the earth. Greece fractured. Rome would later rise with iron strength. The cycle of power continued exactly as revealed beasts ascending from restless seas, horns rising, rulers boasting, nations trembling. Daniel did not see those transitions with mortal eyes. He had already entered his rest. The prophet who once stood before Nebuchadnezzar now lay silent in the dust of exile. No royal funeral marked his passing. No golden statue commemorated his name. He left no dynasty behind him, yet something greater endured. His words, generations after him, would unroll the scroll bearing his visions. In seasons of oppression, when foreign rulers defiled sanctuary and persecuted the faithful, they would find in Daniel's testimony a pattern that anchored courage. The arrogant king who exalted himself above every god would not be permanent. The desecration would not last forever. The beast would meet judgment. The saints would receive the kingdom. Daniel's life had become more than biography. It became prophecy embodied. He had shown what it meant to live a citizen of heaven inside hostile empire. He had demonstrated that conviction need not be loud to be unbreakable. He had revealed that prayer behind closed windows can shake unseen realms more than decrees shouted in palaces. But beyond his example stood his greatest revelation, the Son of Man. When Daniel saw that figure coming with the clouds of heaven, receiving dominion from the Ancient of Days, he glimpsed a kingdom unlike any before it, not forged through siege, not secured through intimidation, not corrupted by pride, everlasting. That vision outlived him. Centuries later, when another captive generation walked beneath Roman occupation, they would remember Daniel's words. When a teacher from Galilee spoke of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, Daniel's scroll would stir in the minds of those who knew it. When persecution intensified, believers would recall the courtroom of fire where books were opened and judgment rendered from throne of white brilliance. Daniel had never wielded sword, yet his visions confronted empires more powerfully than armies. In the fullness of time, the patterns he saw converged. Pride still rose in rulers. Beasts still devoured. The holy still suffered. But through it all, heaven's decree did not waver. The kingdom granted to the Son of Man began unfolding not with spectacle of imperial parade, but through sacrifice, resurrection, and proclamation that no tomb could hold authority granted by the Ancient of Days. Daniel's final promise echoed across centuries. Those who sleep in the dust shall awake. For him, that promise was personal. He had been told, "You shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days." The exile would not remain in dust forever. The servant would stand again. The lion's den had proven that death is not ultimate when God commands otherwise. The resurrection he foresaw would reveal that truth universally. And so the story that began with a teenage captive refusing the king's food did not conclude with burial beneath foreign soil. It extended forward into fulfillment he had only glimpsed in vision. Consider the arc of his life. He entered Babylon stripped of homeland, stripped of temple, stripped of familiar identity. He was given foreign name, foreign education, foreign authority. Everything around him pressed toward assimilation. Yet he purposed in his heart. That decision shaped every chapter that followed. From palace to furnace, from banquet hall to lion's den, from riverbank vision to final rest, his consistency remained rooted in quiet allegiance to the living God. He never overthrew Babylon. He never led rebellion. He never reclaimed Jerusalem by force. Instead, he revealed that sovereignty belongs not to the loudest throne, but to the highest one. His faith did not prevent exile, it transformed exile into testimony, and in doing so, Daniel became bridge between destruction and hope, between fallen temple and promised restoration, between beastly dominion and everlasting kingdom. Empires are measured by territory. Daniel's life was measured by fidelity. In the end, Babylon's golden walls crumbled, Persia's administrative precision faded, Greece's speed fractured, Rome's iron rule cracked. But the kingdom spoken in Daniel's visions continues, unshaken by centuries. The Ancient of Days remains seated, the Son of Man reigns, and the saints will receive the kingdom. Daniel's narrative closes not with spectacle, but with assurance. The faithful may live unseen by history's monuments, yet they are known in heaven's court. They may rest before fulfillment arrives, yet they will arise when the appointed time comes. The beloved exile who once interpreted dreams for kings will stand again not as servant in foreign court, but as heir in everlasting dominion. Kings rise, beasts roar, nations tremble. But above it all, the throne of fire burns steady, and Daniel, who walked through the shifting shadows of empires, now rests in certainty that the kingdom he served in obscurity will outlast every power he ever witnessed. This was his legacy, not survival alone, not prophecy alone, but unwavering allegiance to a kingdom that cannot be destroyed.